Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing the album Cressida by the band Cressida.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
If it wasn't obvious already, this being a self-titled album means that it's their debut album. It doesn't always mean that, but this is Cressida's debut album, and here are some of my favorite bits from this album. So this is the British band called Cressida, formed in 1968 and disbanded only 2 short years later in 1970, which is pretty much oddly a year before their second and last album was released in 1971, and that album of course is Asylum, which we've already reviewed on this list. Now Cressida are one of those earlier prog bands that actually helped mostly in defining what prog could and maybe even should sound like. I know that progressive rock can go in many different directions, but these guys gave us the groundworks for what differentiates progressive rock from normal rock music. Of course, with their addition of some blues influences and jazz influences and even classical influences, they managed to create this template for progressive rock. But within their own confines, these guys didn't really go ahead and further out much more than what they already knew how to do, and that really shows, seeing as this first album of theirs sounds a lot like their second album, and when I say a lot, I do mean a lot. Like, technically you could easily just put these two albums together, mishmash them both, you wouldn't even notice that anything has happened. Each and every song is definitely self-contained, you don't have a lot of transitions from one song to the other, and as I said, both albums really feel like they were made as one. But if there's one thing that I will have to say, there is one album out of the two that is the superior one, and that one is definitely Asylum. Now you might be asking yourself, how can both albums who sound pretty much the same have one which is superior, definitely, and one which is definitely inferior? And I think that the phenomena we're dealing with in this case is really quite an odd one. We have a band that were able to somehow entirely redirect the course of their music while still somehow remaining to sound exactly the same. So while Asylum was a pretty much flowing album despite the songs not having any relations or connections to each other, it just kind of flowed. There was a feeling about it. Every single song was fun and there was a reason for it being there, unlike today's album, which feels like a bunched up group of a lot of very different songs which both also sound the same, but as I said, they're very different from one another. They don't have any connections, any relations. I don't feel like I'm going through moods or even some sort of experience with this album. It just kind of is, with a lot of its very short tracks which don't really mean a lot, and then it just moves onwards. I think that the right word to describe this album would be pretty much meaningless. There's no reason for me hearing this one. The most prominent thing you can find on this album, and probably on the second as well, is of course the Hammond organ and the various keyboards alongside with Angus Collins' vocals, which are the two leading, let's say, instruments or whatever that lead this album. And while on Asylum they are used fantastically in various different ways, I find that on this first album they're mostly being used quite excessively and without much consideration to their inherent sound and what do they add and take from the music itself. So songs like Home and Where I Long to Be or Spring 69 or even Down Down were really ones that blew the wind out of my sails. But on the other hand, we have songs like Winter of Coming Again or Time for Bed or even One in a Group, which were pretty much enjoyable, but again, nothing close to most of the songs to be found on Asylum. And it's pretty much funny that I'm saying all of this because a lot of people would consider both these albums to be pretty much equal in their status, some thinking that maybe there's one that's better than the other, but overall, as I said, their similarities do translate to the masses and a lot of people just think of these two as pretty much equally good pieces of music, while I personally found there to be a pretty much big gap between the quality of them both. And if there was one song on here which really kind of bugged me out, was definitely Tomorrow is a Whole New Day. This song, it's a great song, very good, maybe not my favorite from this album, but I won't get into the technicality of why that is. But it's a great song, it's very grandiose, it uses the Hammond organ, the vocals, a huge solo at the end. It is pretty much amazing, it caps off this album in a fantastic way. So why don't I like it? Well, this album just simply doesn't deserve this kind of ending. It didn't really take me on any sort of journey. There's nothing that led me to this very big point on here. I don't feel the satisfaction of coming to the end of this album in this way. It just kind of feels like a very good song pretty much put into not the right place for it. And this brings me into a shower thought that I had. I didn't think of this in the shower, but this is something that I would normally think of if I were in the shower, and that's that this album might have its redemption in a very odd way. I think that if someone very talented, and of course the band themselves, took the songs they created for this album, took out their motifs, like the actual motifs in each and every song, and compiled them all together into like 4 big pieces, it would have created a much more listenable album. Because as it stands, each and every track tells a tiny little story that I honestly don't really care for, but if you took these really tiny stories, mush them up together, put them into the bigger tracks, you might actually get something very enjoyable. And this is something that they definitely tried using in their second album, in Asylum, because we have 2 tracks on there which are definitely longer than what Cressida were known to have made thus far, and they definitely show to be their better and stronger suits. And as it stands right now, the song Munich from Asylum is definitely my favorite from this band. Now that I know their entire discography, I don't even think that anything comes close to that song. It's a really good song that like they haven't recreated even once. They have shown some hints of stuff that sound like Munich, but never really got close to that. But all in all, I don't think that the first debut album by Cressida is necessarily a bad album, but it's definitely one that I just can't help to not be indifferent towards. It isn't very much a meaningful album, and that's a thing about it, and it's really odd for me because both this and the second album are very similar, but as you might remember, I gave their second album a rating of 9 out of 10, which is basically as close to perfect as you can get, and if you've already deducted from anything that I said in this video, this one will definitely not be getting a 9. But this album does take the #1 spot in one aspect, and that's definitely its cover. This cover makes use of 3 main colors, and that's something that I always love being used on an album. I think that it's splendid, and I always like covers that feature only 3 colors on them. And of course you have the imagery of the Cressida shaped hole in the wall, which you might call a window, and that makes for a very memorable style and very memorable cover. I am glad that they took a very different approach in their second album cover, and I do like that cover very much, but I think that in the sense of memorability and overall good artistic design, this one definitely takes the cake and remains a very memorable and very much timeless album cover. The one thing I did notice about this one though is that the Cressida shape in the middle, well, it isn't really in the middle, it's more towards the right and even downwards in most variations I've seen on this. I've yet to see a version of this cover where the Cressida is actually very very much centered in the middle, and that's kind of odd to me. I do know that this album and their second album are very rare, but if anyone here manages or has one copy of this first album, I highly suggest that you go ahead, take it out, check out to see if the shape is actually in the middle, because as it seems, it is very much off center. So unlike the prestigious 9 out of 10 rating that I gave the brother of this album, this one will definitely be receiving less, and again it will be receiving a very compromising rating of 6 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to Bilateral by the band Leprous. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wanham and Wrist of Kings, you are the best. And if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.